this is, and we're only going to use like little, we're doing the soundbite thing, so we're just going to take excerpts of what you're saying. So if you want to stop anytime, say something over again, I might have you, say something over again if I need you to say it a little bit differently to make it fit into the video better.
Okay.
I'll challenge you. What are their
Let's,
Testing, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4, testing, testing, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4, testing, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4.
with reacting right then and not saying, I'm going to wait until I get closer and then apply. And having to do with having room to stop. And that applies. Spots. don't suddenly cut in front of them if traffic is coming to a stop and you want to change lanes because the lane that large vehicle's in is a little shorter than yours or it's moving a little faster. If you suddenly move in front of one of these larger vehicles, they need a much greater distance to bring their vehicle to a stop than a passenger car would. Those laws of inertia, something that has that much mass needs more space to come to a stop. And a passenger car can stop in a much shorter distance, so if you pull in front of that vehicle and then come to a stop, you're running the risk of being rear-ended. Whether it's a school bus or whether it's a city bus or a large truck, they just need more space. Along those same lines, with larger vehicles, buses in particular, they have other hazards, and that is passengers getting on and off. That vehicle can be stopped somewhere along a curb, and whether or not they have the lights flashing on that bus, there's always a risk that someone is going to be crossing in front of or behind that bus, and they may not be paying attention to passing traffic, or they may assume the traffic is stopped. So as a general rule, if a bus is stopped, whether it's a municipal bus or whether it's a school bus, without the lights on, it's always a good idea to slow down and assume that there are going to be pedestrians coming out from the front or the rear of that bus.
Okay. Let's talk about road hazards and the changing conditions on a road. Someone may be driving safely for normal, optimum conditions. All of a sudden something changes. The road is wet and slippery, or do people always adjust to change for those conditions?
They don't, and apparently, or obviously, if they're thinking of the consequences, they really should. And road hazards come in a large variety of different types. You have weather hazards that will make driving unsafe or make it a little more risky. You have hazards that have to do with the roadway itself, whether the roadway's under construction or there's potholes or there's something else uneven about the surface. And you also have hazards, for example, from a dropped load. There may be something on the roadway that's fallen off of another vehicle. There may be an animal in the roadway or a traffic accident in the roadway. So it could be temporary type hazards that are there as well, even on the day where it's nice and sunny and it's a clear, bright day. With weather hazards, those are easier to react to because obviously that condition is going to exist and you'll have time to adjust to it. It's not something sudden. And drivers should slow down. Many drivers are under the impression that if the sign says that this is a maximum speed limit, that you can drive with that speed under all conditions. And it's just the opposite. That's the fastest or that's the maximum speed that you can travel under ideal driving conditions. So when you have adverse weather, whether it's rain or fog, you should slow down enough without getting into numerical values. An easy way to remember how fast or how slow you should be traveling is tell yourself if a hazard were suddenly to appear in the roadway around this next curve or just ahead of this vehicle that's in front of me, or if that vehicle in front of me were to suddenly stop, would I be able to safely slow down and stop without hitting that hazard? So if you're driving and it's very dark or it's very foggy and you look to the limits of your vision and you say, I can only see 75 feet, you should be saying to yourself, if something were suddenly to appear 75 feet away from me, can I safely slow down and stop? And if the answer is no, then you're driving too fast. Wet conditions, you have those same hazards, but you also have the hazards of traction. We would assume that we can still drive at maximum speeds when it's raining, but obviously when your car is negotiating curves or if the rain has just started and there's still oils in the roadway, it's very slippery. The white lines in the roadway or the arrows, the painted surfaces, they have less traction than the actual asphalt too. So if you're traveling across those types of things, we've all felt that. You can slide a little bit on those as well. So you need to reduce your speed under adverse weather conditions. As far as the non-weather type hazards, objects in the roadway, for example, just as we were talking about earlier with following too close, if you're too close behind a vehicle ahead of you, you may not see an object in the roadway that driver sees and is planning on reacting to when they get to a spot where they can actually change lanes to go around it. And now you're there and this hazard's directly in front of you and you haven't seen it and you don't have enough time to react to it because you couldn't see around that vehicle in front of you. So you want to make sure that you always think to yourself when you're driving, do I have enough time to safely slow and stop if a hazard were to suddenly appear in front of me?
Excuse me, Larry.
Mhm.
We got a little bit of...
How do you handle those things? Do you
Sure.
cover that?
Yeah.
Okay. And equipment failures, things like that.
Okay.
Okay, maybe we can do that. We're talking about driving in these hazardous conditions. Like if you're in wet roadway or snow or something, what are things you can do to avoid getting into a skid?
Well, first thing, of course, is to keep your speed down. That's first and foremost. That would be most important. And one thing to remember.
Can I have you do one thing?
Sure.
Use the word skid when you preface it
Okay.
to avoid getting in. Okay, I'll ask the question again.
Okay.
So how would you avoid getting into a skid?
Well, when it comes to skidding or keeping your vehicle from skidding, first and foremost, reducing your speed is most important. If you're driving too fast, of course, that will you always have the chance that you're going to induce a skid. One thing to remember about skids or locked wheel skids is that if your vehicle starts skidding, you can turn the steering wheel in either direction and it's not going to turn. You're going to continue to slide in the direction that your vehicle was going in when you first started skidding. So to avoid that, besides braking gradually and braking before you actually get to a hazard, if you want to, as much as possible, brake in a straight line. If you're driving in adverse conditions, whether it's snow or rain, and you're approaching a curve, you want to start braking before you get to the curve and try to negotiate the curve without using your brakes as much as possible or using them very lightly. So you want to brake in a straight line as much as possible. Recent advances as far as anti-lock brake systems that are on most cars nowadays may give drivers a false sense of security. Those will keep your wheels from locking up when you're traveling in a straight line, but if you're negotiating a curve, you can still go into a broad slide. Your vehicle can still skid sideways, and so you don't want to develop a false sense of security in that you can take curves faster than you normally would because you're not going to go into a slide, because you can still do that. But vehicles without anti-lock braking systems or anyone driving under adverse conditions, straight line braking as much as possible. Try to negotiate the curve without applying the brakes if you can, because again, once you start skidding, you're just going to keep sliding in that direction, which is usually off the road if you're in a curve. And lost my train of thought there.
Well, say you do get into a locked wheel skid. What should you do then?
Okay, if you do find yourself in a skid, the best thing you can do is get off of the brakes. Even though you might be thinking to yourself, I won't have enough space to stop, if you keep skidding, you definitely won't have enough space to stop. It'll take you a much further distance to bring your vehicle to a stop if it's sliding than if your wheels are actually turning. So if you feel your wheels locking up, then just release the brakes and reapply them. So once you release them, you'll gain traction again, so that if you are in a curve, you can continue to negotiate the curve. And if you're traveling in a straight line, you can reapply the brakes, and you'll stop much faster by letting off of the brakes, getting traction back, and reapplying the brakes than you would if you continue to skid. And that's kind of a misconception with many young drivers, is that the harder you brake, the faster you're going to stop. Once your vehicles stop turning, you're not going to stop faster than if your wheels were still turning, but turning much slower than, of course, the vehicle is moving. So you want to keep the wheels turning.
Okay. What about if you have an equipment failure in the car? Say like you have a tire blowout. What should you do then? If
it blows out while you're actually driving, and you can feel that you've lost, we're not talking a gradual loss of air. If you feel a catastrophic tire failure while you're driving, the best thing you can do is to gradually come to a stop. Avoid locking up the brakes again, because you may end up losing control of the car. Just take your foot off the gas pedal. Make sure you have a firm grip on the steering wheel, and coast as much as possible if you have space. If you need to use the brakes, just use them lightly. But if you can, just coast to a stop out of the traffic lane. And one thing to remember too is that occasionally a person will get a flat tire, and wherever they come to a stop is where they'll change that tire. Once that tire has gone flat, if you've driven on it for a few feet or a few hundred feet, it's beyond repair pretty much anyway. Unless you come out to your car that's parked there in the morning and find a flat tire, you may be able to repair that. But if your tire fails while you're driving, you're not going to repair it, it's going to be replaced. So there's no need to stop as soon as you can and try to fix that tire or change that tire right then and there. If you're on a freeway or if you're in a bad spot, move your vehicle onto the shoulder and then drive nice and slowly with the flat tire to a safe place, whether that's the next off-ramp or whether that's a nice wide spot in the road where you can change the tire. You don't have to change it right there where it goes flat. So staying off of the brakes is a good key too.
That's a good point. Yeah, life is worth a lot more than a tire.
Yes, you're already going to replace that tire, and as you were saying, our life is more important. But you've also done something else too. Besides putting yourself in a hazardous position, you put other drivers in a hazardous position now too, because now you're an obstacle on the roadway, or you're an obstacle on the shoulder that's partially in the roadway. Many of us, if the flat is on the driver's side of the car, it's tough to stand on the shoulder of the freeway and change that tire, so we might find ourselves standing in the traffic lane in the freeway and assuming the drivers see us, and that's not always the case.
What's another common type of equipment failure on a car that someone might have to respond to?
Well, occasionally I've seen some vehicles where, and this is very rare nowadays because cars are a lot safer, but occasionally a person's hood may fly up when they're traveling. I've seen that happen in a few cars. Some drivers will react appropriately. Some will slam on the brakes and come to a stop right then and there. If there's no other cars around, that may be fine, but if you're in heavy traffic, that's another accident waiting to happen. With most vehicles, you'll probably notice that if the hood does fly up, there's still a space near the bottom of the windshield where you can still see the roadway. You can still use the window. Same thing with every other hazard, try to gradually come to a stop and out of the traffic lane to repair it. Worst thing you can do is stop in the traffic lane, especially on the freeway, to fix anything in the vehicle. Other failures, usually lights. If a person's lights go out, that's usually something that's just due to a lack of maintenance. Very rarely will we have both headlights go out at the same time in a vehicle that's traveling at night. So if we maintain our cars and fix those things as soon as they're broken, you won't have a situation where you're driving with one headlight, now the other one has gone out, and you're driving in complete darkness. But those are the most common.
So what would happen if you didn't maintain your vehicle and both headlights did go out?
Well, if you're driving at night and that happens, then you're pretty much stuck calling for a tow truck or calling for someone to bring you assistance. You can't drive at night without headlights, regardless of what got you in that situation. You would want to move your car out of the traffic lane if that happens. If you find that that's a situation, you want to get over under the shoulder, turn your four-way flashers on. That's permitted use of four-way flashers if you need to warn other drivers that your vehicle isn't properly illuminated. But you'll want to move out of the traffic lane, stop your vehicle, and then call for assistance. You don't want to continue driving at night without headlights just because you may be able to see. You might be able to see down the roadway far enough to drive home, but it doesn't mean that other drivers can see you, and if they're moving much faster, they're not going to have time to react when they do notice that there's a vehicle ahead of them without lights, whether it's headlights or taillights.
Do you ever come across power steering failures or brake failures?
Usually, if you have a power steering or brake failure, it's because you have engine failure as well. If a person's engine dies on them while they're moving, then those things will only work for a few more applications, and the steering will become very difficult. If you can continue to control your vehicle and move onto the shoulder and coast to a stop, that's fine. But those usually just require just a little muscle. You just have to try to stop in a straight line. If your vehicle comes to a stop and you're in the traffic lane and you can't move it to the shoulder because of engine failure, then you're best off turning on your four-way flashers and then moving away from the vehicle onto the shoulder yourself and calling for assistance.
Okay.
Pause tape there.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. Let's talk about if we've tried to be a safe driver, but if you do wind up getting into an accident, minor kind of accident, what should you do in that situation?
Well, immediately after the accident happens, you want to make sure that yourself and any other persons involved in the accidents aren't a hazard to approaching traffic, because the last thing you want to have is another accident happen as people are swerving to avoid the vehicles if they're in the traffic lane. And once you've done that, you want to make sure that yourself and anyone else involved in the accident doesn't need medical assistance. If they do need medical assistance, unless you're medically qualified, you want to avoid doing certain things and trying to move them depending on the severity of their injuries. But what you do want to do is that if no one's injured, and it's a property damage only collision, meaning that it's only the vehicles that have been damaged, then it is okay to move those vehicles out of the roadway. Many drivers are under the impression that they have to preserve the scene. If someone's injured and they can't be moved, yes, you'd want to leave those vehicles there. But otherwise, if everyone's fine, there's nothing wrong with moving those vehicles out of the traffic lane. The last thing you want is to have another accident, as I said earlier, because of people wanting to preserve that scene for the officers. When the officers get there, they would rather investigate one accident than 2 or 3, and as long as the people are still there and they can tell them where the vehicles were, that's sufficient. So it is okay to move the vehicles. After, you'd also want to exchange information with the other drivers if there are other drivers involved. And we all have a responsibility. When we think of the term hit and run, we think of someone actually fleeing from a scene in a hurry, but that also covers things like your responsibility to exchange your personal information as far as the information on your driver's license, the information on your vehicle registration, and insurance information. If you leave the scene and you don't exchange that information, that is considered hit and run, the same as a person that actually flees from a scene. So you have that responsibility to the other drivers. Same thing would apply if you hit a parked unattended vehicle or someone else's property, for example, a fence around their house. You would be required to leave information either with that person if you're able to find them at that residence, or in a conspicuous place where they could actually find it later on their door or on the fence, on the damaged portion of the fence. But the key is, as we were saying, you don't have to leave vehicles in a traffic lane. For most of us that live here in California, we know that in the larger metropolitan areas, traffic congestion is a major problem. As a matter of fact, when people have been surveyed, they consider traffic to be one of the things that's aggravates them the most about living in large cities, as opposed to violent crime or other things, because we all have to deal with traffic, regardless of how we get to where we're going, whether we're a passenger in a bus or driving a car. And when you have that accident, it affects traffic for miles and possibly for hours. It could back up traffic for hours just because of a property damage collision, because the people were under the impression that they couldn't move those vehicles when actually they could.
I'm glad you brought, that's one of my pet peeves. You know, I've seen that so many times.
Yes.
So, yeah, that's good. Okay. What about when you hit an animal?
Well, depending on the type of animal, of course, and this is just the way our society is structured. Some of those animals require that you report their injury or their demise to the owner. For example, if you hit a farm animal or if you hit a dog, if you could find the owner of that animal, you'd want to report it to them. If you can't, if the animal is injured, of course, most of us have cell phones nowadays, but by some means you'd want to contact the appropriate law enforcement agency and animal control as well. As long as that animal is still alive, animal control will come out there and take care of the animal for you. If the animal is deceased, if it's still in the traffic lane, you'll still want to report that. Whether or not you request an accident report be taken, you'll still want to have an officer or someone come out there to make sure the roadway is clear so that other drivers don't hit the animal as well. One thing about animals too is that many of us have pets, and we have fond feelings for certain animals, and so some of us will go to great lengths to avoid hitting an animal that suddenly runs in front of our car. It can't always be avoided. You have to weigh other factors. If I swerve to avoid this animal, am I going to hit a pedestrian? Am I going to hit a parked vehicle? It may not seem like much of a consequence if you hit someone else's vehicle, but even slow speed accidents can result in injury, sometimes significant injury. Both vehicles may not come to a stop right away. You may have passengers that aren't wearing a seatbelt as they're required to, and they may injure themselves because you had an accident avoiding an animal. So you kind of have to, like we were saying earlier about giving yourself plenty of time to react. If you're driving along in rural areas, say to yourself too, if I'm driving in this area and a deer or some other animal suddenly runs out in front of my vehicle, am I driving at such a speed that I'll have enough time to slow down and safely stop? Not always, depending on how close the animal is, but if they're close to your vehicle as well, when they suddenly appear, do you have enough time to react and maintain control of your car, or are you going to run off of the road into a ditch or a ravine or into a tree? So some animals can't be avoided, or some collisions with animals can't be avoided.
Like you said, you just have to weigh the factors, and if you've got a sense of what's going on around you, that would probably help.
Yes, and yes, if you are aware of your surroundings, for example, if you always want to leave yourself an out if you can. If you're traveling and there's multiple lanes going in the same direction that you're traveling in, if you're driving so that you're always next to another vehicle, if something happens, you're not going to have room to swerve. You should try to make sure that you have enough space around your car, or that you're aware of what's around your car, so that if an animal suddenly darts in front of you or some other type of hazard, you know the the lane next to you is clear if you need to take evasive action, or you know that you can hit the brakes and there's no one directly behind you. So knowing what's around you and being aware of your surroundings is key to either avoid the accident or to minimize the effects of the accident after you strike this animal.
Excuse me just a second.